Yeah.
You know what I mean? But you come from so far away, Neil, you'd have to really schlep to come up.
It's not too bad. Not too bad.
Okay. Oh, hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm here with my dear friends, Imam Jihad Turk and the Reverend Neil Tadken. I know the titles well. Nice to see you all. I know, can't see you. Nice to know you're here. Nice to feel you. Oh, look, this is nice. We're happy to have you. We have a really interesting, we're planning to have a really interesting conversation that I think you'll enjoy or you'll find fascinating. We find it fascinating. So hi, Jihad, welcome. How are you?
I'm doing well. These are beautiful weather days, although we do need some rain.
Yes. And Neil's in Utah.
Yes, I'm up here in Mormon country as an Episcopalian, so I'm up here to visit with my dad, and I'm glad to be here. It's fun to see you all.
Same here. So we're going to talk tonight about troubling texts in our own holy books and things that we wrestle with. You know, the word Israel means wrestle with God. So we're always wrestling. And, they say 2 Jews, 3 opinions. There's always, different interpretations. But some things really need to be looked at deeply because they are troubling or upsetting. But because Neil and I have been talking so much, Jihad, I'm going to start with you. So why don't you start with, I think we'll just take turns and we'll go around and talk about different ones and we'll see where we go. So.
Well, as I mentioned before we got started, there are no troubling texts in Islam. So next, no. I wanted to share a verse that is on the face of it very challenging. And of course, I think as we're all going to do, we're going to look at the face of it, and then we're going to share with those listening and watching how it is that we process and deal with text. So the verse that I'm wanted to start with is in chapter 2 of the Koran, verse 191. And I'm going to say the verse in part, and then I'm going to contextualize it, and then I'm going to read the whole verse, and we'll go from there. We'll have a conversation. So the verse reads, وَاقْتُلُوهُمْ حَيْثُ ثَقِفْتُمُوهُم, which, is the Arabic, obviously. So you can see why it's so controversial now, which reads in translation, slay them where you find them. And of course, when you hear that, you immediately think, oh, see, the Quran says kill Jews and Christians. That's not what the verse says. It says kill them where you find them. And then some people say, well, see, look, it's justifying terrorism or something else. So I want to say a context before getting into the text itself, but we will. So stop me and jump in at any time, Neil and Susan, to question. But I wanted to say something about how it is that we deal with the text, the hermeneutic, the way of interpreting, exegesis, as they say. It took me a minute to learn that had nothing to do with Jesus, but just interpreting text. So the Quran as a scripture for Muslims, I think we touched upon this before, is perceived by Muslims to be a text that doesn't have a history, in the sense that the text of the Quran was not something accumulated over centuries with different authors or different prophetic voices or different books. It's all one book. And Muslims believe it was revealed to Muhammad through the Archangel Gabriel, and it was received over a 23-year period, the last 23 years of Muhammad's life, from the year 610 until the year 632. So it's only 22 years solar, 23 years lunar. It was completed before he died, and Muslims memorized it. The Arabs around him were a the culture was an oral culture, meaning very few people learned how to read and write, but they memorized long poems, and it was, they memorized things incredibly long. So the scripture of the Quran is not that long. It's 114 chapters. Some chapters are a third of a page. Some are 50 pages long. But the entirety of the text is not that long. And Muslims attribute it to Muhammad and believe it to then be divinely inspired, literally the word of God, communicated to Muhammad, who then, with fidelity, transmitted it to his companions, who some of whom he assigned as scribes to write it down, 10 of them, and hundreds and thousands actually memorized it in its entirety. All of that is simply to say the way of interpreting the Quran, unlike that of both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, is one in which we don't start by looking at, okay, well, what was the context of the time in which this was written down, because it reflects the people of that time. That's not something that happens in the Islamic context.
I just want to interrupt and say Orthodox Jews believe similarly about the Torah, that it was given by God, from God to Moses at Mount Sinai, word for word, and that every word, is the word of God. So that is one section of Jews. Other Jews believe different things. So there's some similarity in that respect.
Absolutely. And however, even with the Orthodox Jews that believe that for the first 5 books of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, or the Torah, or the Pentateuch, as Christians would call it, the rest of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, was, there's
different writers.
There's different writers over a couple thousand years, right?
We're
talking about
800 years.
800. Moses lived 1600 BC?
1200,
and then the final, it was canonized 100
no, like 400.
400 AD?
No, BC. The
Torah,
not the whole Bible.
No, that's what I'm talking about, the whole Bible.
I think like 100 BC.
100, okay. I thought it was 100 AD, but in any case, that's still over 1,000 years of.
And then there's the Talmud, which constantly reinterprets it.
Right. Very good.
Until 600 AD.
So there is that shared commonality with the first 5 books and the Orthodox Jewish community, but the entirety of the text of the Quran fits within that for the Muslim community. And so given that, all of that is to say, then when you have a challenging verse, you have a real challenge, because you can't wiggle away from it to say, oh, well, maybe God didn't say that, or maybe some other person, or reflects this author or this time or this context. So you're limited then in how you interpret. So you still can interpret things literally or metaphorically or contextually nonetheless, and still try and extract a principle. So with all of that said, what does the Quran say about violence in general? And let me read the rest of the verse, because the rest of the, people oftentimes, I think in Christianity, they call it source. What do they call it?
Proof texting.
Proof texting, right? I don't know if you have that in the Jewish tradition, but
we do.
Yeah. So so sometimes when I'm speaking publicly, people will say, well, come with bullet points from talking points from a right-wing blog or something. And they'll say, oh, see what, the Quran says, kill Jews and Christians. Here's the verse. And they'll quote what I just shared, kill them where you find them. So this is the entirety of the verse, translated by Muhammad Asad, who's actually a rabbi who converted to Islam in 1917, I think, and traveled to Arabia and became a scholar, living with the Bedouin desert Arabs, and did one of the most fascinating translations of the Quran called The Message of the Quran. You probably never heard of him before, Susan. Mm-hmm. But it's one of the most popular translations of the Quran, is by this Austrian, I think he was an Austrian Jewish rabbi from a lineage of rabbis
Wow,
who,
interesting.
yeah, Muhammad Asad, he took on the name Muhammad Asad, and Leopold Weiss, I think was his name before he embraced Islam. Anyway, so the verse reads, kill them. One second. Okay. And slay them wherever you may come upon them, and drive them away from wherever they drove you away. For oppression is even worse than killing. And fight not against them near the inviolable house of worship, unless they fight against you there first. But if they fight against you, slay them. Such shall be the recompense of those who deny the truth. But if they desist, behold, God is much forgiving, a dispenser of grace. Hence, fight against them until there is no more oppression and all worship is devoted to God alone. But if they desist, then all hostility shall cease, save against those who willfully do wrong. That's actually three verses, 191, 192, 193. So who is the they? First of all, it's not the Christians and Jews. So the context of this text is that Muhammad started, who was from Mecca in Arabia, was preaching from the age of 40 to the age of 53, 52 in Mecca to his countrymen there. They were fellow tribesmen. They were from the tribe of Quraysh. And they were pagan. They were pagan Arabs. They worshiped idols that they made with their own hands. And they believed in God, the creator. But as the Quran says, if you ask them who created the heavens and the earth, they'll say, God. But then, then they'll claim that God has these other, sons and daughters. And then they, in the form of these idols, and they would worship those idols. So what happened was when he first started preaching, there were people who were monotheists in the tribe. It was kind of a loosey-goosey, religious context there because, they were pagan and they did whatever they wanted, right? But they kind of had tribal idols. And everyone in Arabia had their own, each tribe that they belonged to had their own set of idols, and they all converged on Mecca for the pilgrimage because they all, even though they saw Abraham as their forefather and Abraham built the Kaaba in Mecca, over the centuries, they started this, practice of worshiping idols, and they became superstitious. And so Mecca was one of the rare cities in this nomadic landscape of Arabia, and it had water, and it had a marketplace, and it had a safety zone. It's kind of like when you're playing tag and you have a home base, can't tag me because I'm here at home base. Mecca and around it was like a safe place. Outside of that precinct of Mecca, it was the Wild West, the wild Middle East. So, tribes would raid each other's caravans and try and steal from each other. And it was, kind of rough and tumble environment because there was scarcity, limited water, limited resources. And so the tribes kind of engaged in trading using camels, and they would go from the south and Yemen up to the north and the Roman territories, and they would trade frankincense and other things. This is important, and I'm going to conclude here in just a second, but all of the interpretation of the Quran is super dependent on this kind of environment because the context is that. So when Muhammad started preaching about only worship one God, the people of Quraysh said, wait, you're one of, our respected members of our clan or our tribe here in Mecca. That is not a good business message because you are you are turning away all of our customers who are coming here to do business, get water, and worship their idols in safety on their as a midway point between the south and the north. And that doesn't look good. So first they said, look, shush about all that, worshiping only one God. We stop doing it. He was protected by his uncle, who wasn't a believer in him, but who said, look, he's my nephew. He was born his father died before he was born. His grandfather, who was the leader of our tribe, took him under his wing when he died. I kind of took over his protection. So he's kind of like, he's a made man, right? He's protected. No one from the tribe can touch him because, you know, the people in our division of the tribe, our clan, will go after them. So no one could really, you know, harass him, but they've tried buying him out. They said, look, we'll all pitch in. We'll make you the wealthiest amongst all of us. Just stop this message. It's not good for our reputation, our business, and all of that. We'll let you marry the most beautiful woman. We'll make you in charge. Well, whatever you want. Just stop this message. And he says, nope, you can put the sun in my right hand, the moon in my left, but I will not stop, you know, preaching. So he had integrity. So long story short, he kept preaching. He started getting, you know, the message appealed to the down and out, the marginalized in society. And he had several hundred followers. His uncle dies. So now he's unprotected. And he's kind of desperate, and he's looking around like, where can I go for safety? Because, you know, now I'm at risk. And all of the other members, the other clans within his tribe got together and they said, all right, we're going to take him out. So around the same time, the nearby city, about, you know, 300 miles north of Mecca, the city of Yathrib, they said, oh, we see in Muhammad a peacemaker. We've been having this feud for generations. We want to make peace. We see in Muhammad a peacemaker. His mother was from our city. He's from a good family. His message is something that could bridge our gap and stop the blood feud. So he had found this home, this alternative. So he agreed with them. He said, look, take all of my followers. I will come later. The people of Quraysh said, fine, you want to send all your followers there? You can't go. You have to stay here, but you can send all of your followers, but they have to leave all of their property behind. And so they confiscated everyone's, some of them were quite wealthy, confiscated all the property. They all left. Hundreds of people made the migration from Mecca to Medina. Muhammad stayed behind. And when they were going to assassinate him, he was able to slip out. He escaped. He made a circuitous route and he made it safely to Medina. Once there, so that first 12 years, he never lifted a finger. No one was allowed to fight. It was kind of very, you know, it was turn the other cheek, very Jesus-like in terms of how they engaged the rest of society. Those who were unprotected, some of them were martyred, some of them were tortured, some of them were killed. He also at one point sent a bunch of the most vulnerable to Africa to live with a Christian king who protected them. But finally, when he was in Medina, he received a revelation that said, okay, you can now fight against those who fought against you because of your faith and who expelled you from your homes. So the Quraysh, he's talking about the pagans of Quraysh. I went really long, but this is really to say, yes, for the last 10 years of Muhammad's life, he was authorized to engage in what was quite normal, you know, quite regular and normal in the context outside of the precinct of Mecca, which it says the inviolable, you know, precinct, meaning Mecca, don't fight there. But if you encounter your enemy in the wild, you know, desert, fight them where you find them. But if they are inclined and expel them from where they expelled you from, but if they are inclined to peace, you must make peace. God doesn't like those who transgress. That's really the principle of warfare in Islam. It's a defensive war. It's to, you know, reclaim the property for the context of the Muslims of the time of the Prophet. But it is not, as some Muslims and many non-Muslims would take this verse completely out of context and use it to justify all kinds of things. That is not the context. That is not the principle. That is not the idea that was refined over the centuries about how, you know, warfare should happen in Islam.
So do you think radical Islam, because we don't hear it anymore, but originally they would refer to the West as the Crusaders. And we know that the Crusaders were brutal to the Muslims in Jerusalem and in the Holy Land. They were brutal. They slaughtered them, and they wanted to reclaim the land for Christianity. And so do you think they take that verse and say, even though it happened hundreds of years ago, we still have the right to kill them where we find them because of what they did to us then?
That is an excellent question. And someone like a bin Laden will, in his speeches, or had, I should say, he's obviously no longer, but he had a paradigm in which his refrain was, we should expel them from where they expelled us, looking at this verse in that context. Yes, some people will use it in that context. And and it's also based on sort of a classical Muslim legal framework to say, okay, well, these lands are Muslim lands, Dar al-Islam, and the territory beyond Muslim control is not Dar al-Islam, is not the abode of Islam. It's kind of a contested area, etc. That being said, I mean, it's a very sophisticated topic where international relations was something that was expounded upon over the centuries, how to engage in diplomacy, how to engage with neighbors, etc. The principle, one of the principles early on, and this is also in chapter 2, verse 250, I forget the verse number, but it says, La ikraha fid din, qad tabayyana ar-rushdu min al-ghayy. There is no compulsion in matters of faith. Like you cannot force someone into converting to Islam. This is a principle in the Quran.
But it was done by Christians and Muslims over the centuries.
It was done rarely by Muslims. And hear me when I say this, because the impression is, oh, Muslims, this is how Islam spread. Muhammad died in the year 632. By the year 715, Islam had conquered Spain and was all the way to China, the western part of China, and conquered the part of the Byzantine or the Roman Empire, and had conquered all of the Persian Empire. Within 90 years of Muhammad's death, Islam had spread, over the majority of the known world at that time. However, militarily conquering that territory did not mean that the populations were forcibly converted. Demographic studies have shown that the majority of those populations that were Christian before, and I'm talking about Egypt, which were Coptic Christians, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, the Levant, majority Christian of different kinds of Christianity, remained majority Christian for over 400 years.
Right.
And only through a process of intermarriage and conversion and population and blah, blah, blah. And until, places like Iraq and Syria and all of that, even to this day, somewhere between 5 and 10% of Egypt is Christian, Coptic Christian. Up until the Syrian, conflict just a few years ago, over 10% of Syria was Christian. Mm-hmm. There are still, Christian tribes in Jordan and, Bethlehem. Think of it. Bethlehem was where? It's in the West Bank of Palestine. They are Arab Christians, and they still are there. Now, only in recent years has the number of Arab Christians in Palestine declined. But the point is that Islam has been there for 1400 years. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, up and through the Crusades and even past the Crusades, was for the most part under Muslim control. And those churches were not destroyed. The services continued. And there was only like a rare individual who would commit an act against the Christians, but that was the exception. Even think of Saladin, or he's known in the West, but Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. Saladin, who fought against the Crusades, when he expelled the Crusades, he still allowed the churches to stand and the worship to take place there, and anyone who wasn't openly hostile in fighting against the Muslims, he allowed them to practice. So this was a really, really long segment, but I wanted to sort of, this is kind of the major issue in the Islamic tradition is, does the Quran promote violence? And there are books written by Western academics. What is a more violent text, the Bible and the Quran? And this is not, a
Bible is really violent.
Well, this
Very
is not
violent,
a competition, but those kind of neutral third party, academics say, look, the Quran is not nearly as violent as the Bible. And so, but I'm not criticizing the Bible, or I'm not going after, or
I
whatever.
am.
That's fine. But I'm just saying that the Quran, the challenging text, somewhat you can say, okay, well, yes, the Quran is not a pacifist text. Yes, the Quran, after Muhammad moved to Mecca, says, yes, you may fight against those who fight against you. But it's really not that violent in the sense that it says, look, if your enemy is inclined towards peace, you have to make peace. I mean, it doesn't say go out and kill and slaughter and women and children and animals and all of it. It doesn't say anything like that. There's nothing that's really, 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 out of the ordinary in terms of, kinds of conflict.
I would say there's a lot of early violence in the Torah when they're fighting the different tribes, then they enter Jericho. And the thing is that it's in there. And, some Jews will say absolutely it happened, but a lot of archaeology says they didn't enter the land of Canaan and wipe out the populations, because for hundreds of years, they're always saying, stop following the Canaanites. Stop doing what they do. Don't marry them, and don't, do their sacrificial rites and all this stuff. And they found thousands of Canaanite fertility goddesses, archaeologically. So they actually did live together. And this is where, I look at the Torah and it's about something else. And I know Orthodox Jews would disagree with me, but biblical scholars, Jewish biblical scholars, will say sometimes this small people wrote these very heroic deeds because they were so small, in order to feel important, in order to give themselves heart and hope and courage and whatever. And interwoven with that are these amazing ethical teachings. You know what I mean? Right. It's a real juxtaposition. There's many, it says, remember the stranger 36 times because you were a stranger in the land of Egypt. And then it says, go in and wipe out the Canaanites, or go in and wipe out Moab or whatever. And it's like, really? How do you justify these?
Right.
And, Orthodox will say, well, they were, and maybe they were bitter enemies trying to wipe out the Israelites. It's similar to the Koran. You're allowed to defend yourself if your life is at stake. But again, our teachings are the teachings of how to live your daily life are to be peaceful and loving and kind. So Neil, what do you want? You haven't said a word, so come on.
Well, actually, to segue, talking about the conflict and confusion around violence, I'd like to bring up the sacrifice of Isaac story, because here we have a story where most people, have understood the story of the sacrifice of Isaac as God testing Abraham to see if he will obey God's command. And we're thinking, what kind? I mean, the God that we're told has created us is a God of love. Why would such a God command his beloved servant to sacrifice, to slaughter his only son to God?
I just want to stop you for a minute, but isn't that considered a metaphor for Jesus on the cross? I mean, didn't God sacrifice his only son?
That's a very, yes, we can kind of go, well, we can go into that subsequently. Yeah. Yes, but yes, there's this whole notion of, does God cruelly sacrifice or ask us to cruelly sacrifice and commit murder, actually, to show our faithfulness. And one of the scholars that I read looked at the text, and in looking at the text, you will see that the first half of the story, it'll say, and in the English translation, it'll just say, God says such and such, God, 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 God. And God, tells Abraham, gives all the instructions about, gathering the wood and bringing his son up the hill and to build the pyre. And, but at the moment that Abraham is about to take the knife and kill his own son, the word for God changes. And we go from Hebrew words like Elohim, which is a name for God, but it's also the generic term for God, like small g. And then all of a sudden it is, and then the angel of the Lord, Adonai, a different understanding of God, says to Abraham, stop. I will provide a different sacrifice. And of course, then a goat appears. So the interpretation is that Abraham was being led astray by the old understandings, the old ancient world understandings of their local gods that were common throughout the ancient world that did demand human sacrifice. And what the challenge was for Abraham to be actually able to hear the true God speak and get through to him. And so Adonai, the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that God says, no, don't do this. Never do this. This is not what I want of my people, and substitutes animal sacrifice for human sacrifice.
So how do you explain Jesus dying on the cross as a sacrifice?
So in many, in some classical understandings in Christianity, there has been the notion that that God basically allows or has Jesus sacrificed on the cross for our sins as a way to, because otherwise God would be so angry and wrathful at all of us, he may as well just wipe out humanity. And only through his beloved son, Jesus, do we find redemption. The other way of looking at it in Christian theology is that it's not that. So when Jesus is sacrificed, quote unquote, for our sins, it's really Jesus is sacrificed because of our sins. We're the ones who crucified Jesus. Humanity fell short over and over again, and we couldn't hit the love that he expressed. It was so challenging to us and was so threatening to the established authorities that we could not, we felt compelled to get rid of him because he was too much of a threat.
So it wasn't God's plan? So
what God's plan was to expose our through that we would say that God's plan is to redeem what we do as evil and make life and goodness triumph nevertheless. So God intervenes and raises Jesus from the dead to show us that the folly of our obsession with trying to control life by our imposition of death on others. So it's not that Jesus dies so that God doesn't destroy us. Jesus dies because we couldn't stand what he had to say. It was too threatening. And God nevertheless says, okay, we will prove that death is folly. It doesn't have the last word. Therefore, you have nothing to fear. Therefore, there is no reason. If there is no fear, there is no reason to kill others.
Which doesn't work in the real world because they're killing all the
Yes,
time. But you know,
fear is what kills us before we die.
So it seems to me, and Jihad, you can. I'm curious about the view of the Koran view, which is the sacrifice of Ishmael. So we can talk about that in a second. But it would be, if I were a Christian, it would be more comforting to me to think people killed Jesus, but God resurrected him. That it wasn't the plan, that Jesus didn't die for our sins. Jesus was resurrected to show us that a pure being has eternal life, so to speak, because he is the epitome of love and goodness in your theology.
Right.
And yes, he was a human, which means we could be as good as, or try to be.
Exactly.
But people, human beings killed Jesus, not God, blah, blah, blah. But God resurrected Jesus to show us that goodness can always be resurrected. Or there's that even if it's a metaphor, which I know people don't
that
like,
life wins. Yeah.
Light and life and love will resurrect or prevail.
Exactly. You articulated it so much better than I did.
Oh, but that would mean that God didn't sacrifice Jesus.
No, God did not. I personally do not believe that God sacrificed Jesus. I think Jesus's death was inevitable given what he was preaching and what we couldn't stand to hear.
Or he was very dangerous to the authorities. He was a very big threat to the authorities.
Exactly.
Both authorities, I would say.
Both Rome and
the corrupt priesthood, because they were corrupt.
Exactly.
They were appointed by Rome, and they were corrupt. They weren't,
especially in that period. Yes.
Yeah, they weren't your typical Jew on the street. They were a corrupt elite,
and they were collaborators.
Probably. I mean, everybody in the whole country, everybody was Jewish, so they were bad, good, whatever.
Right.
But I want to go back to this idea of the sacrifice, and I want to involve jihad in this because there are many, and I know the Koran doesn't think this. I think I know this, that Abraham actually failed the test. When he was asked to sacrifice his son, he should have questioned God, and he said nothing. And the reason that many commentaries say this is because very early, not long before, God had said to Abraham, I'm going to destroy the city of Sodom. And because they're so evil and they're so wicked, they don't deserve to live. And Abraham said, well, wait a minute. What if there are 50 righteous men? Will you spare them? And God says, okay, for 50. What about 45? What about 40? He bargains with God all the way down to 10. And by the way, that's why in Judaism, you need 10 people, 10 men it used to be, for a minyan, which is a congregation to say certain prayers. That's the minimum. You need 10 to say the Kaddish, which is the mourner's prayer, to read the Torah, whatever. When God told Abraham, I won't say Moses, to sacrifice his son, he says, your only son, the one you love, Isaac, he says nothing. He never says, why? How could you? Wait a minute. What if you take me instead? What if nothing? He just does it. And so many commentaries think he that was not what God wanted. God wanted him to question that. And as I mentioned earlier to Neil, in our text after that, Abraham and Isaac never speak again. And they don't even live in the same place. And Sarah dies right after that. And the rabbis say that when Sarah heard that Abraham was going to sacrifice her son, she had a heart attack and died. And so there's all this trauma and tragedy around it. And it's not a test of faith. It's a failure of, well,
it's a failure of faith. It's a failure of his, like the fact that he would bargain with God, but then all of a sudden it's like he forgot everything, and he was listening to this fallacy of God, you know.
I like that.
Which is why I think the interpretation I was talking about and the interpretation you were talking about blend very well together.
They do.
Because it is a failure on his part not to have questioned and having fought back. It was like he became gullible to the quote unquote false gods of the world.
So Jihad, what do you think when Abraham sacrifices Ishmael in the Koran, or almost sacrifices?
Yeah, first of all, I remember reading this with Rabbi Mel Gottlieb and Dr. Jerry Campbell. We were looking at the text, and you kind of referenced it now. So according to the biblical narrative, the firstborn was Ishmael, and he was roughly 14 years old when Isaac was born?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So how old was Isaac in the biblical narrative when he was to be sacrificed?
Well, it doesn't say, and like Orthodox commentaries will say something ridiculous, like he was in his 30s. So, and that he was a willing participant or something, but we don't know. He's called the child, the youth. He's called the lad, the youth. They don't call him the boy.
And they call it the binding as well, like the binding.
Because they bound him up on the altar with ropes.
Right.
So whether he was willing, this is to make sure if he was willing that he didn't change his mind. I guess, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I asked that because it's unclear as to when this would have happened, when the actual sacrifice, story applies. But in the Quran, it's different. As you hinted, it's Ishmael. Not by name, but when you read the story in the Quran, it's clear that it's Ishmael because, first of all, in the biblical narrative, it says sacrifice his only son.
But they say the name Isaac.
I understand that, but it also says his only son. Well, he has a son already.
No, he doesn't say your only son. He said take your son.
It does in the book of Genesis. You can look it up.
It says your son.
Your only son. No, look it up. It's in the book of Genesis. We did a Bible study with this.
Oh, well, maybe it's because Ishmael is gone now because she's kicked him out and there's no other son left because Ishmael has been, they left. Sarah kicked them out.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
So that's why I'm going to look right now, though.
Yeah. It does say it, but the point that I was making wasn't that. It was that the same narrative exists in the Quran that he was like Abraham really wanted a son. And then, to the point where, Sarah, his wife, was barren. And so he finally took the decision to marry Hagar, the handmaiden. And then she bared him a son, Ishmael, right? Now, in the Islamic narrative, it wasn't that Sarah kicked him out. It was that Abraham, as a prophetic figure, who was the patriarch of monotheism, he received revelation to send Hagar and his only son at that time, Ishmael, when he was an infant, before Isaac was born. He was still an infant. He sent them to the wilderness of Becca, or Mecca as it's known, and there Ishmael uncovered as an infant toddler while his mother is looking for water. He uncovers with his heel the well of Zamzam, and there Abraham visits them some years later when he's 13 years old, age of puberty, etc., when he's becoming an adult, a man, age of reason. And together Abraham and Ishmael build the first temple or sanctuary to worship God, known as the Kaaba in Mecca. So the narrative in the Islamic tradition, some of it's in the Quran, some of it's in other sources, is one in which it's not this petty disagreement between the two wives, but rather it was divine inspiration that had Abraham send Ishmael and Hagar to the desert, and there he established monotheism. And if you look in the book of Genesis, it says from both of them, there will come many blessings,
yeah.
right? Great
Right.
nations, and from Ishmael will come great nations, etc. So it's not like he was out of the picture or they never like interacted again. And even in the book of Genesis, it indicates that Ishmael and Isaac both together bury their father in
Right, but do you
Hebron.
think Abraham did the right thing when he was about to sacrifice Ishmael?
So given all
And
of
you're
that
right, it does say
context,
your only son. You're right.
Yes.
yeah,
Okay.
no, I mean, I wasn't guessing. We had studied this. So
You're right, but I wanted to check. Go ahead.
But in any case, so the story goes, on one of the occasions, he's 13 before Sarah is pregnant with Isaac. He visits Ishmael. He finally has the son, right? Now he's come of age, and then God testing him in what he loved most. He wanted the son so badly. So God then inspires him with a dream. In the dream, he sees himself sacrificing his son. So what does he do? He goes in the Quranic narrative, he goes to Ishmael and he says, I see in a vision, I see that I'm sacrificing. What is your opinion? What do you opine? Mada tara, what's your reaction? And, he says, you'll find me patient. Like, I'm going to go along with it. You're a prophetic figure. This is a divine inspiration. If you are to do this, then I'm going to go along with it. He also then goes and asks the mother of Ishmael, Hagar. He says, I had this dream. What do you think? And she also gives a similar answer. Now that's in the Hadith narrative, not in the Quran.
Completely different.
It's very different. It's very different. So he's a willing participant for sure. And when he goes, and again, it's not that God told him, kill your son. It's like he had a vision. He interpreted the vision to mean that he's supposed to, but really, maybe the dream was ambiguous enough where God just wanted to see how far he'd be willing to go if he really truly did devote himself to God and was willing to do whatever, give up whatever, however much he loved his son, willing to give that up for the sake of God. And of course, the story is similar. As he's about to sacrifice Ishmael, God then intervenes and sends down a ram, and the ram is sacrificed. And similar to what Neil was hinting at, you could interpret this to mean that, human sacrifice is not what God wants. And there are verses of the Quran, God, your life, your whatever is, it's ultimately about your devotion to God. And so don't die for God, live for God. That's kind of the takeaway. And this is kind of a very powerful way to communicate that you shouldn't die for God, but you should live for God. And when you sacrifice the animal, it still is a sacrifice because that was wealth at that time. It was measured in how many animals you owned. And when you slaughtered one, you shared the meat with those who are needy. Usually in the Islamic tradition, you hold on to a third for your family, a third for the community, and then a third for those who are impoverished. And so, sacrificing really was giving up your wealth. And even on Hajj today, you can, part of the reenactment of the pilgrimage to Mecca involves the sacrifice and commemoration of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son. But, now you can, instead of sacrificing it on the trip, you can either fast instead, which is mentioned as an option in the Quran anyway, or you can you can have it done somewhere else in a country where there's hunger and poverty, and just have the meat distributed to those in that country. So you're on Hajj instead of doing it there, which used to be back in the 90s when I went for pilgrimage, was your only option. It then became, they developed a system where you can have it done somewhere else simultaneously to that moment and fulfill the ritual, but in a way that it actually fulfills the vision, which is sharing the wealth with those who are impoverished.
Well, that's interesting.
That's the story in the Islamic
completely
context.
Different.
Very different.
Consulting the boy, consulting the mother. It's completely different. So I want to bring up probably one of the most troubling texts, which is the text on homosexuality that is in the Torah. It's actually mentioned a couple times. And the one that I'm looking at is in Leviticus 18, where it says, do not have sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman. That is detestable. And this has been, and there's a couple other places where it repeats that this has been the foundation for a lot of persecution and rejection of homosexuals in our society.
Right. We call those the clobber passages in Christianity. Yes, the clobber passages. Yeah.
So what's really interesting, again, is something like Jihad said, which is the context. Where is it in the Torah? And what surrounds it? And so what you have to look at, and this is something that I did a lot of research, and there's also one, if a man lie with a mankind as he lie with a woman, both shall have committed an abomination, they shall be put to death, and their blood upon them. I mean, they go that's in Leviticus. So what we have to see is this chapter in Leviticus is a chapter about all these different taboos that you're not allowed to do. And this one of homosexual sex is among a huge list of incest and sleeping with different members of your family, sleeping with animals even. But the introduction and the conclusion of the text is what new modern scholars say, put it in context. So here's the introduction of the chapter. The Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, I'm the Lord your God. You must not do as they do in Egypt, where you used to live, and you must not do as they do in the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you. Do not follow their practices. You must obey my laws and be careful to follow my decrees. Then after this whole list, it says, do not defile yourselves in these ways, because this is how the nations that I'm going to drive out of you became defiled. Even the land was defiled. But the native born and the foreigners residing among you must not do any of these detestable things, for all these things were done by the people who lived in the land before you, and the land became defiled. So what did they do, and what are they talking about? So it turns out that the way that these two societies worshipped was to have these sexual practices. They were fertility rites. Also, in terms of incest, we know in Egypt that the pharaohs married their sisters, that they married in their family because they didn't think anybody else was godlike enough. So that's the whole incest thing. But their religious practices consisted of having sacred prostitutes, male and female. And when you had sex, when a man had sex with a priest, it was like he was having sex or connecting to the god that he represented. If a man had sex with a priestess, he was connecting with the goddess. There was a kind of worship. Mm-hmm. And they would use children and they would use all kinds of people for this. And they said, this is how you're connecting to the gods or the gods. And so this is what new scholars say, having ritual male prostitution is what this is referring to, not having sex with a man, or it says, don't, even your aunt, your sister, everybody, all of this is dishonoring because it was considered worshiping these other gods. So it wasn't talking about a loving relationship between two men. And there's actually a loving relationship between two men in the Bible. Well, some people say, which is between David and Jonathan. King David loved King Saul's son, and they say that he loved him more than any woman. That is what is actually in the text. So what does that mean? You can say, okay, they were just best friends, or was there something deeper going on? But
your love surpasses the love of women. Yes.
Their love surpasses the love of women. There's no condemnation. There's nothing. Right. And so it's possible to see homosexual love in the same context as heterosexual love in Judaism, which is in marriage or in a committed relationship, in respect, in kindness, or whatever. It's possible to see that, though and I don't even think this is a Christian problem, but in Orthodox Judaism, there's an admonition not to waste your seed, your sperm. And so you would be doing that in homosexual love as you would be doing in masturbation, or you would be doing if you, practice some kind of method of birth control. So there is that. But
which of course was rooted in, they had no concept of modern genetics, where an egg and a sperm came together, and that this was only the belief was in the ancient world that all life originated in the male, and it was simply implanted in the woman who became the vessel for gestation.
right.
So the idea of spilling your seed was like, you've just wasted all this life.
Exactly.
Because it was like all these little human beings were now didn't end up in the right place. Yeah.
Exactly. So if you look at it that way, there's no abomination or death, or it's really about, again, pagan practice and
Right.
keeping a different kind of relationship with God.
Right.
So that I thought was really interesting, and I just recently did a chapter on that. And they also, just one more thing that I found that they've talked about, sexual intercourse. Historians tell us that Canaanites and Egyptians worshipped a goddess of love and fertility called Astarte or Ishtar. Within her temples were special priests called Asinu, who were deemed to have special powers. Physical contact with the Asinu was believed to ward off evil and promote good luck. These priests were in effect living good luck charms, and worshipers would often ritually touch them as part of their worship practices. Sexual intercourse was considered especially effective for gaining the goddess's favor, because the male worshiper was offering his greatest possession, semen, which thought to be the essence of life, to the goddess through her priests. Depositing semen in the body of a priest, which is a male of the goddess, was believed to guarantee one's immortality. Similar cultic practices flourished in connection with many other ancient pagan deities. So we were talking about homosexual prostitution is what was being forbidden. So now I'm happy to hear your response, disagreement, whatever you want to say about it.
No disagreement here. And in fact, there are, I believe when even in Paul's, in the New Testament, most of the passages that are quoted to say that Christianity condemns homosexuality are based on Paul's letters. And I believe even within the letters of Paul's context, he was often talking about the also had to do with ritual prostitution with male prostitutes, because the word used that he uses is word for a male prostitute, not for a same-sex relationship, so to speak. So it kind of goes along, and and Paul, of course, had been a very righteous Jew before, as a Saul, before he became Paul, as a follower of Jesus. That has been that interpretation that you just shared is really quite accepted and standard among more progressive Christian theologians who've looked at the texts very closely.
So what about in Islam?
The story of Lot is mentioned in the Quran.
Yeah.
And the Islamic tradition, so Islam is the least organized religion on the planet, in the sense that there's no hierarchy, structural hierarchy that decides who's in, who's out, what is legitimate, what's not. And so the way that doctrine and dogma is developed and has been in the Islamic tradition is through I wouldn't say consensus, but through a intellectual discussion of amongst scholars of the faith. And there are different schools of thought, different methodologies of deriving Islamic theology as well as law. But all of that is to say that the conclusion, not that there is a particular verse in the Quran that one points to and says, oh, this is a verse that's explicit in regards to homosexuality. Yes, in the story of Lot, you can draw the conclusion that the kind of sexual relations that were taking place there are not acceptable.
But it was rape. It was homosexual rape in the story.
Yeah, you can look at it in different, with different interpretations. But nonetheless, I referenced this kind of body of intellectual literature over the last 1400 years, simply to say that the conclusion reached in interpreting not just the Quran, but the teachings of Muhammad was that the, sexual relations are limited to the context of marriage or concubinage, which, there used to be a practice within the, historically.
Yes.
Was limited to those two contexts and between opposite genders or sexes. And so that's kind of the Islamic interpretation. I mean, there's not really a whole lot of.
So what happens to homosexual Muslim children or people in your community?
So yeah, the idea of homosexuality is somewhat modern in the sense that the historic text talked about sexual relations outside of marriage between men and women or between, same sex as, I mean, it happened. It wasn't, there wasn't the sense that this was, as the former president of Iran said, there are no gays in Iran. It's not like,
or Russia,
delusion, that this didn't happen. There's an acknowledgement. I mean, I remember when I was at Berkeley, I was reading a 13th century Egyptian shadow play written by Ibn Daniel, and it was kind of a shadow play, like a puppet play that would have been performed before marriage. And it was, somewhat, vulgar. I don't know if, I mean, it was very explicit. Let's just put it that way. And what was fascinating in this body of literature is this, it's a Muslim culture. This is a piece of literature. It was written in colloquial, by the way, Egyptian colloquial, in the 13th century. But, it talked about how, having sexual relations with a beautiful young woman or, a young man, or as just, part of the temptations of life, right? Drinking alcohol, doing these things. And these things are outside of the, sexual relations outside of marriage, or, it was considered a vice, but, these were temptations, meaning that, they happened, right? People were tempted to drink. People were tempted to have these kinds of sexual relations. That being said, there wasn't this notion of homosexuality as like, I identify as such, and this is my identity per se. I mean, it was a little bit more, I guess, fluid in that sense. That being said, all of those things, sexual relations outside the confines of a marriage, is something that has, historically and in the broad consensus of contemporary Muslims as well, is still in effect. It's considered not permissible in the Islamic tradition, and there isn't a central figure to come and reinterpret things, etc. So Islam is more conservative in on this topic. That being said, there are people who identify as homosexual and Muslim today, and how they reconcile those two worlds. They have the sexual attraction. Some abstain. Some, it's not always black and white. You might be attracted to both, bisexual, both men and women, and so they'll just, maintain a monogamous relationship with a Muslim woman who they marry, etc., and just not fulfill that part of their sexual desire. some people are, involved in homosexual relationships and still identify as Muslim, and just ask God for forgiveness for the transgression that they perceive that they are undertaking when they engage in sexual relations outside of marriage between a man and woman. So, and other Muslims would say, well, my interpretation of things is such that, it was, as you're saying, it wasn't referring to same-sex sex, but rather it was something more violent, or male on male rape, or something else that's being referred to in the Quran. So you will find a very, very small minority of Muslims who would interpret the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet to not consider it sinful, but most Muslims in the world today do hold that same-sex marriage, same-sex sexual relations is not permissible.
Well, Orthodox and, very traditional Jews feel similarly, as do fundamentalist Christians.
Exactly.
What I mean? It's whatever, but in Judaism, as we know, it's not just one, it's like Islam is one sort of monolithic belief system in Judaism with ripples or whatever, but in Judaism, there's stuff that we completely disagree with, other sects of Judaism, and we just live with it and say, okay, well, that's what you think, I don't. But we have that tradition from the Talmud where they're always disagreeing, and so it's not a stressor really to say, okay, that's what they believe, I don't. We're all Jews, I love them, I would protect them, defend them, help them, but I have a niece who wears a wig and wears long sleeves all the time and doesn't have sex with her husband for half the month because she's unclean from her period, and in her mind and in his mind. And not only that, they can't sleep in the same bed. They can't touch the same plate. I mean, I love her and I respect her, but I don't believe that. And
yeah, I mean, the only thing I would say is that I wouldn't say that the Muslim community is monolithic. Even if on this issue, most Muslims would not feel empowered to make a drastic shift from the historic understanding, because it's number one, it's a big claim to make, and it's kind of a scary spiritual thing to say, is like, well, this is what the plain text or the straightforward teaching seems to be saying. I'm going to interpret it in a very radical way, or a way that's a departure from this accumulated wisdom over the centuries. And I'm going to do so in light of, popular sentiments, or, maybe different notions of gender today, or identity, et cetera, et cetera. It's just, people are reluctant to do that. And understandably, because, first of all, someone who was going to go through the effort of interpreting the Quran and in an authoritative way with a lot of evidence, scriptural evidence, and exegesis and hermeneutic, and all of that sort of approach to how to understand scripture, it would require a lot of sort of formal training to do it in a way that was convincing or carried a lot of weight. And there isn't a lot of discussion amongst people who've gone through all of that training, who are then pushing the envelope on this issue. And so those who are kind of pushing back on this issue tend to be not fully grounded in the scholarly tradition itself, sort of pushing back from a more visceral or gut kind of position, as opposed to a scholarly position. And so that's kind of the state of this issue in the Islamic world.
So I know you want to talk about women and stuff, but I want to just do something really fast to show the thinking and where Jews get this idea that, there are multiple interpretations. Because there's one thing, and I know, Neil, I'm sure you hear this, it's the Old Testament justice, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And I just hate that. Old Testament, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. This is from Exodus 21. And in Judaism, that absolutely does not mean literally an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It's completely wrong. And the rabbis say, the way we know this is that what if somebody has one eye and you say, oh, you have to take out his other eye? There's no intention to make someone blind. What if someone dies from cutting off their hand? Then you've way surpassed the possible punishment or retribution. And they actually founded and this is in the Talmud, and that's why the Talmud is so connected to everything. It means to pay the damages for the eye, the damages for the tooth, the hand. And not only that, and then I'm just going to make this quick, but I think it's fascinating. They even, and modern legal jurisprudence uses the Talmud for this. They said there are 5 grounds for liability. They don't just say you pay for it. You have to pay for 5 different kinds of damages if you harm someone. The damage proper, pain, let's say an eye or a tooth, you pay for the repair, okay? You pay for the pain and suffering. You pay for the work that you have to miss. It's called stoppage of work while you're getting your suffering or until you recover. You have to pay for the cost of the cure, not just the damage, but you have to pay the doctor's bills, and you have to pay for the shame or the disgrace of it. Let's say you don't have a tooth, or you look horrible, or a beautiful girl is disfigured and now she can't get the same kind of husband or whatever. They go to such detail of what an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth means. It has nothing to do with poking out someone's eye or chopping off someone's hand. It's about how to compensate for the damage you caused. And it's 2,000 years ago, they were talking about the shame and the pain, and the cure and everything shows they really thought this through. So I just feel the only thing that you can't pay damage for is if you kill someone, because there's no way to repair that. So that you can't do. But other than that, it's always how to actually pay reparations. So I just wanted to share that, because I hate when they say Old Testament justice. Oh, the Jews with their Old Testament justice. It's just not true at all.
Now, interestingly enough, among most thoughtful modern Christian Protestant denominations, we would no longer really call it the Old Testament. We would call it the Hebrew Scriptures.
Right, but it's still the Hebrew Scriptures justice, whatever.
Yes, exactly. But one of the question I have is that I came across some scholars who talked about how an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth was actually a huge step forward in justice, because in most cultures, in most ancient cultures, it was, you rape my daughter and I go and slaughter your entire kinship, 3 generations of your entire kinship. It was sort of like, no, that's like, you cannot just go in and, go crazy to, in spite for a wrong that has been committed against you or a loved one, etc.
You can't have blood feuds.
That you cannot have blood feuds. That this is a way to say, wait a second, we have to step back and look at what's been done to who and what are the extent of the damages. And you certainly cannot inflict more than you have already had inflicted on you. You have no right to do that.
Right. Though we could get into a whole thing, and this segues into jihad and about the treatment of women, because if you rape a daughter, you pay the father money. Or she can marry the guy if she agrees. So sometimes rape was like they slept together. It's interesting, but rape is not considered grounds for killing or anything like that. So it's a whole other thing, but I don't want to go into that. I want to go into, I know this will be our last one, Jihad, about, you wanted to talk about women.
Yeah, I always say that there are three great, negative perceptions of Islam. One is violence, one is women, treatment of women, and one is just surrounding the idea of God, right? A lot of people don't realize that Muslims are monotheistic and worship God, the creator, right? God of Abraham and Moses and Jesus. So with regards to women, they're generally, I would say, and this is very controversial for me to say it in this way, but I'm going to say it anyway. I would say Muhammad was coming with a message that was empowering to women. And if you interpret feminism as like bringing equality for women, then he brought a feminist message in that before Muhammad, women were not to own property, generally speaking. They in Arabia, they in fact were considered property of their husbands, and when they died, a man might have 100 wives, and then the children would inherit the wives other than their own mother. The women did not receive a portion of the inheritance. They did not have to give permission to be married off. Their fathers would simply marry them off. They had no right to divorce. And it was considered shameful to have a daughter as a firstborn. And in fact, they used to, in pre-Islamic times, bury their firstborn alive if she was a girl, hoping that the firstborn would be a male. The next born would be a male, because it was considered shameful to have a daughter as a firstborn and honorable to have a son as a firstborn. And, there are probably structural reasons as, why that would happen, why that was a value, because, having a male is someone, raising someone that can help your tribe succeed in the harsh environment of Arabia, where if you have a daughter, you're going to raise her and then marry her off and she's going to go to some other tribe. And, there were probably financial and other reasons why, but nonetheless, this was a pre-Islamic time. Muhammad came and said, and the Quran says, how dare you kill a girl? For what sin is she buried? It is honorable to have a daughter as a firstborn or as any born. And if you have 3 daughters and you raise them well, you're guaranteed paradise. Women not only have to give their permission to be married off, they also have the right to divorce. And, divorce is something still not allowed in the Catholic Church till this day. You can get annulment possibly, but, divorce is still not allowed. So, and then also women, the dowry is not paid to the father, it's paid to the woman directly. So she gets the gift and she owns her own property and she receives a portion of the inheritance. And, and then the limitation from having 100 wives or whatever, unlimited, to only 4, people think, oh, you can marry 4 wives. That was a huge step forward given the context before, where there was this unlimited number of wives that one could have. So it was limiting it to 4. I think there was also stories in the Bible about individuals marrying multiple women. But
absolutely.
Yeah, but then the rabbis forbade it.
Yeah, so it kind of got changed. But the Quran says, look, you can marry one up to 4, but you have to treat them all equally, and you cannot treat them equally. And so some, most Muslim countries now forbid multiple marriages. You have to, or polygyny as it's called, because they say, for whatever reason, their interpretation is that it's not permissible these days. So that being said, there is a verse in the Quran that is on the face of it challenging, but in the context, and this is how I deal with this challenging verse, is to look at it in the greater context, and also at how the Prophet Muhammad discussed this issue. So the verse is known as the beating verse. It's in chapter 4, verse 34, and I'm going to read the entirety of the verse. It's a little bit lengthy. Men shall take full care of women with the bounties which God has bestowed more abundantly on the former than the latter, and with what they may spend out of their possessions. And the righteous women are the truly devout ones who guard the intimacy which God has ordained to be guarded. Now for the controversial part. And as for those women whose ill will you have reason to fear, admonish them first, then leave them alone in bed, then beat them. And if thereupon they pay you heed, do not seek harm to them. Do not seek to harm them. Behold, God is indeed most high and great. So what does this mean? Well, the word in Arabic is nushuz, and it's not new shoes. It's one word, nushuz, and it means like a great indiscretion, some kind of maybe a sexual misconduct or some kind of really outrageous behavior. So the question then comes, is this giving husbands a right to deal with their wives who are behaving in an outrageous fashion, telling them to admonish them, and if they don't listen to you, then abstain from intimate relations with them. And if they don't listen to you, then you may strike them. وَاضْرِبُوهُنَّ, right? Strike them. And if they finally, stop doing that, whatever behavior, then do not seek to harm them. Is it giving the husbands the right to do that to the wives? And what does this word mean? You may beat them. So there's been a lot of discussion on this. And if you read the footnote of a book of the translation of Koran by Princeton University Press, I believe. I'm trying to remember the name of the translator. Hopefully it'll come to me. But in his footnote, he doesn't have footnotes in the entirety of Quran except for like 4 or 5 footnotes. One of them, he has a very lengthy footnote, and it's for this verse. He cites a translation of, or he cites an Arabic dictionary in which the word strike does not mean strike. It means to be intimate with. So the word is daraba, means to hit or to strike or to have sex with. And he gives the verse, or he gives the example from Lisan al-Arab, which is an Arabic dictionary, in which he says, daraba al-jamalu al-naqata, which means the male camel had sex with or was intimate with.
Oops, yeah.
Shtups, there you go. A female camel. And so, a very Arabic example with camels. But nonetheless, so in other words, to follow the logic, this could be an advice for a man on how to deal with his wife if she's misbehaving, to say, sort of tell her to knock it off. If she doesn't, you kind of withdraw some affection. If that still doesn't work, then you become intimate with her. So you kind of reverse it, right? And then
use reverse psychology.
Psychology. And then, hopefully if that should resolve it. If it doesn't, then, if she
then
stops,
you beat her.
no harm.
Then you beat her.
Then there is no, that would be an instead of. Others might say, well, this is not necessarily permission for the husband, but rather this is some kind of criminal behavior, like she's behaving in a way that is whatever, and this is not for the husbands to is a vigilante sort of enact the law, but this was what the state might intervene.
Let me ask you something.
One second before the question though, and this is why I'm not super troubled by this verse, because the prophet, who's the example, and he did marry, he had one wife for most of his life. She passed away, and then he had married several times thereafter. But he admonished anyone. He said, "How could you possibly, hit your wife and then be intimate with her? Like, what kind of animal are you? Like, what kind of person are you that would do that?" And he never was physically violent towards anyone his whole life. He never raised a finger against anybody. And he admonished anyone who would think about treating it. And he said, the best of you are the ones who are best to their wives. So, this is not part of the sanctioned behavior that the prophet engaged in, or that he permitted, or that. So whatever this verse is, it's looked at through the lens of the example of Muhammad, and this was not part of the prophetic example. So to me, this is not a justification or permission or license to be to engage in domestic violence. And some commentators will go to absurd lengths to say, okay, but strike doesn't mean you can punch. It means you can take a handkerchief and do this, or there's kind of absurd, quite frankly, ways that gymnastics that are
mental gymnastics
and interpretive gymnastics that are employed to try and get away from the apparent meaning of this verse, especially in light of the context that I mentioned and in light of the overall sentiment of Islam, in which this is not in keeping with the Islamic spirit, if you will.
So
go ahead, Susan.
Just and then we really have to stop because we've been going for an hour and a half.
Wow.
Yeah, it went so fast. Is there any, like a few times, like you've quoted the Koran, they say these things that are kind of general, like if she has ill will or she does something bad. Is there any place, and it would be like commentary, where they actually say this means these 4 things or these 5 things are the things we're referring to? Is there ever a specific explanation of what this bad behavior would be, or is it, whose interpretation is it of what is bad behavior?
That is an excellent question. The answer is yes. I mean, there are many commentaries on the Quran. The Quran is not that big of a book, but all of those books behind you on the bookshelf would represent a small fraction of the number of commentaries on the Quran.
Right.
It's so numerous, and part of what they do, and there are different ways of commentating on the Quran. One of them would be to define every word, and in this context, it would be looking at every possible definition of the word nushuz. What could it possibly mean? And the scope, and looking at the context at the time, referencing poetry, referencing other verses from the Quran, referencing it. So it's a very sophisticated science of linguistics as one way to look at that, and then there are many other ways as well. But yes, the short answer is yes.
Okay,
there are commentary about exactly
explain what they mean. We have a similar thing where they'll go all over the whole Bible scripture, and they'll find, well, in Proverbs it says this and this is what they mean. So I know what you're talking about. So I want to thank you guys so much. This has been so wonderful, fun. So interesting for us. I hope it was interesting for our people who joined us. And I'm just hoping that maybe in the fall or in the winter we can do one of them in person. I think that would be really fun, and let people ask us questions.
What's in person? What is that?
Like, yeah, really. Who knows? Yeah.
Well, I guess if God is merciful and we somehow manage our way out of this insane pandemic, which just keeps seeming to be prolonged, well, then who knows when that's going to happen.
Right.
Yeah.
We have some great comments. It says, fascinating. Thanks so much. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Learned a lot. Thank you. So I want to thank you.
And Ruben and I traveled on an interfaith pilgrimage to the Holy Land. So
right, she said, I knew that because I learned it from Jihad.
Yeah. So hello, Anne.
So have a wonderful summer. And to those of you who are watching us, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure to have these conversations with the Reverend Neil Tadken and Imam Jihad Turk, and I hope we will do it again. Bye, everyone.
Bless you all. Peace.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.